Vladimir Putin spent his entire career in the KGB, and still today he trusts the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, more than anyone alive. And in the summer 2025, he signed a little noticed order, Decree 502, and that has completely rewired Russia. Every ship now entering or leaving Russia requires FSB clearance. Putin's plan was that he was going to use this to protect the oil pipeline that funds his war. But the FSB realized there was another benefit here, and that was that they could take a cut from every import and export from Russia. This was a great racketeering opportunity. But then the spies spotted yet an additional bonus. If the West is not going to enforce its sanctions, then those oil tankers can also move cash and collect intelligence worldwide, money and surveillance on one floating system. But the moment a security service owns the clearances, it also owns the failures. And in January 2026, there has been a lot of failures. We saw that 8 ships were seized in just 1 month as Western navies moved from tolerance to interdiction. And that creates its own problems. Because when law enforcement boards a ship, that means that they collect evidence. And evidence, that gives names. And names, they create enemies. And when everyone is protecting themselves, nobody's protecting the state, and not its economy, nor its war, nor the man sitting in the Kremlin. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post and National Security Advisor. I was banned from Russia for life in 2010 for working against the Putin regime, which I continue today in Ukraine. If you don't already, subscribe now. Consider becoming a channel member if you want the latest briefings as to what is really transpiring today. So the Grinch recently was boarded in the Mediterranean by French troops. That ship was being used by the Russians to illegally transport oil. But this did something else. It was more than just that ship. What it did was that it triggered a power fight inside of Moscow. Now, you won't see tanks in the streets of Moscow anytime soon, but this battle is a little bit different. It's over the blame, the budgets, the prosecutions, and the survival that will come for some, but not for all. But that raid exposed who owns the failure. But even more debilitating for Russia was something a little bit different. It was that when the profits dropped for Russia, the Federal Security Service is ordered to start squeezing somebody at home. That means that that tension that came from abroad is now in the streets of Moscow. But that pressure turns into not just meetings, but orders for arrest, and that spreads panic. Russia never anticipated that their shadow fleet would be touched by the Westerners, and that shadow fleet is quite an amazing accomplishment. Lloyd's List analysis estimates that the shadow fleet moves about 3.7 million barrels per day. That's about 65% of Russia's seaborne oil. It has opaque ownership and ship to ship transfers, which are supposed to blur the trail. And yet they were surprised that it does not always do that, that the Westerners always seem to be able to find their ships. How does that happen? And that leads to another point of tension. When people in Moscow don't understand how the Westerners know, perhaps somebody inside is talking. Perhaps there is a mole within our ranks. These sorts of questions are poison for an intelligence service. They are poison for a paranoid leadership that today believes that everybody is out to get them. So this is only made worse, though, by another additional factor, which is key. Russia's low on cash. When you're low on cash, solutions are harder to find. And one of the reasons they're low on cash today is that war risk insurance charges have been reported at about 0.65% or more per trip. So on an older tanker, that can mean roughly $80,000 to $315,000 extra for just a single voyage. But imagine that there's a premium spike. Well, seeing historic data, it looks like that could burn up as much as 53 to 208% of a week's net earnings. That's in a moderate market. But during a hot week at $66,000 per day, it can still take roughly 20% to 79% of a week's net profits. Now, insurance pricing turns anxiety into a number that Moscow simply cannot ignore. And when that number spikes, the hunt for culprits begins. First, the premiums jump, and then the loyalty tests begin. Western interdictions convert into something greater. They convert into the capture of manifests, of routes, and ownership links. And photographs then become existent of who is on that ship. But one stop ship starts a paper trail that points back to Moscow, and it points to people who signed off on what would happen there. Now, the people responsible for these things back in Russia are not going to be considered to be the Westerners. Obviously, the Westerners, on their own initiative, boarded those ships, but somebody has to take the blame. Who is responsible within their own ranks for having allowed this failure to occur? And that's why when these photographs appear, a photo becomes a file, and that file becomes weaponized in Russia. That file, once it exists, is turned over to Russia's investigative committee. That becomes then a criminal case. Now, Alexander Basterkin is the one in charge of this. He's the one who brings up cases to find scapegoats and to settle clan scores. He himself was formerly a professor at St. Petersburg State University with Dmitry Medvedev. In fact, Medvedev invited him to his current job when he was still the president. But more than that, he is said to have been a classmate of Putin at that same alma mater. But today we can be sure that in his job, when he looks at all the cases that he has before him, there's only one thing that really sticks out to him. How can he better protect the Putin regime? He's there because he's close to Putin, so his only job is to protect Putin. What that does to the FSB, what that does to the officers, what that does to the entire industry surrounding the illegal shipping of oil is not his concern. He has to go after, with force, anyone who he thinks might have made a mistake, not just to punish them, but to make an example to others. And that creates yet more tensions within Moscow. None of this makes things better for the FSB. But there's another person who would like to see more problems for the FSB, and he would have a legitimate reason for that. You see, these exposures at sea can drag Russia's foreign operations into the exact same fight. Sergei Nareshkin, who runs the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, he's in charge of managing overseas intelligence gathering operations and also influence operations. Interdictions, they risk exposing cover companies through their manifest as well as their bank links and ownership trails. And once investigators demand names, services stop coordinating and start protecting themselves. Suspicion at that point becomes routine. And at that point, we see also that missions get sacrificed to survival. It all gets more complicated for Russia, though, when you consider that they cannot be sure when they'll get their money. At any given time, they're dealing with banks. It's not clear how much the West knows. Does the West already know about that offshore or not? Or is it still safe to use it? Now, EU scrutiny slows transfers, and Moscow answers by squeezing more people at home. That puts pressure on the elites. But consider just that sector, those who are in charge of collecting the money from these transfers. High risk labeling makes payments slower, pricier, and easier to flag. Transfers bounce, approvals stall, and accounts get frozen mid chain. And delays force a cash hunt, and that cash hunt becomes terrorism within Russia, as people do not know what will happen next. Now, you recall the Red Terror in Russian history, when Joseph Stalin decided to kill thousands upon thousands of his own citizens. What's interesting about that was that that was Russian on Russian violence. And today, what people fear the most is their own government. Within Russia, people do not fear that the Ukrainians will invade them tomorrow, but they do fear what their government will do to them. And what is happening right now is that the government is looking for scapegoats. As we saw in the Soviet Union, when that happens, it usually doesn't work out well for the citizenry, but it also does not work out well for the elites. Today, when you're looking for scapegoats, you can be sure that it is something that signals to the population that you're out of solutions. But there's something else that Russia should worry about. When maritime income turns risky, the Kremlin locks down domestic capital and elite mobility. And what starts as offshore or shipping, that becomes ultimately extraction at home. And we see that extraction happening. Considering how the oligarchs are receiving pressure from the Federal Security Service, the FSB has been arresting top people. We remember the famous case in July 2025 when billionaire gold magnate Konstantin Strukov was detained by FSB officers. Reports had said that he had sought to leave Russia on his private jet. Now, what was interesting about that was that he was in good terms with the Kremlin. In fact, he was a member of the party and had been elected to office before in the party. Yet still, that was not enough to protect him. You saw that his passport was in fact conditional, that his jet is just an option. But when the FSB doesn't want you to have either, they just take them away. We also saw the case of Russian billionaire Vadim Moshkovich, who was arrested in Russia. Now, reporting at the time said the court had extended his detention. It was decided that because he had a private jet, he was probably a flight risk, and that's why he should not be released from prison on bond. But that is sort of important. When you are an elite and you see this, how do you understand this? You see that you've had, in a short period of time, multiple billionaires who are close to the regime, who supported the regime, who had donated to the regime, who are all of a sudden behind bars. And the Kremlin is shaking them down for yet more money. And the reason for that is simple: there's less cash in Russia. So, does it surprise you in 2025 that about 1,500 millionaires are thought to have tried to leave Russia? With those sorts of people leaving, with such capital leaving, it becomes harder for Russia to keep the show on the road. Having a war is expensive. It's certainly not cheap. But more than that, it is something that is impossible to do without money. And if all of this seems bad for Russia, you can be sure that it is, but you can help make it worse. Check out the first pinned comment below. We'll see also a video that you should watch that helps fill in what's happening in today's talk. Right below that, you'll see how you can donate for the Ukraine soldiers and Ukraine to get life-saving equipment to help win this war. And every donation right now is being matched by a very generous donor. Thank you. So when we look at what's going on right now inside of Russia, it can be clear that these problems were not things they anticipated. They never saw the day that they would all of a sudden be challenged, that no longer would they be as clever as they thought. And that's the best part. Because they thought they were clever, they thought they were ahead of the game, they made no preparations whatsoever for a situation like this, where all of a sudden it was no longer going to be profitable to be shipping by sea. Even during the Soviet period, the Soviets were able to get around sanctions by shipping by sea, by doing things like the ship-to-ship transfers out in the middle of the ocean. But today, they don't have that option. And if they don't have that option, what can they do other than go after the elites? But going after the elites has its own problem. Once they check out of the system, you don't have a lot more money in Russia. Russia, over the years, did very little to make sure they had a balanced economy, very little to make sure that the money wasn't concentrated in the hands of very few. But since the money today is concentrated in their hands, Russia is very dependent on them, and they realize that they do not have a dependency on Russia. There's no reason for them to be there. They could be just as happy somewhere else. They'd be safer somewhere else. And if you'd be safer somewhere else, why stick it on Russia? Why stick it on a country where they're prosecuting and persecuting those who have money? For Vladimir Putin, this, though, reaches yet a more dangerous stage. And that dangerous stage is that he gets closer and closer by the day, by the hour, of reaching the critical mass necessary to create real change. Now, imagine who here would have an interest in that. You have the elites who obviously would quickly lose their allegiance to the regime the day that they're persecuted. But you also have people such as those in the FSB who right now are being persecuted. They think it's unjust. They've done nothing wrong. They did what Putin wanted. Yet, because some of those ships were caught, that means that somebody has to pay. But there's an additional group that's very concerned by this. And those would be the people that today sit in Chechnya. Chechnya itself is facing a very destabilizing situation. It looks like fighting there might increase at any moment, as Kadyrov, the warlord that's run the country for years, and his son are both in the hospital. Kadyrov appears to be extremely ill. His son was in a severe car accident, and he is the heir to the throne. So without either one of them, Vladimir Putin is running short on security. And running short on security at this precise moment is some very bad timing. On the horizon, we see that there's already a split in the leadership in Russia. There's those people who understand what's going on. People in the central bank. They've done their best to try to control the economy despite the terrible decisions of Putin. But Vladimir Putin is quite an arrogant man. He's been in power for 25 years. He's considered to be one of the most powerful men in the world. So when he's told by the central bank, you shouldn't do this, you probably should not do that, do you think that he listens to them? Or do you think that he thinks that he knows better? He very much so believes the latter. And as such, he continues to make grievous errors. Those errors include things such as it's doing right now with India. It has now offered India a rock bottom price of $26 per barrel. That is so incredibly low and below the market cost that shows how desperate Russia has become. We see today how there are now tankers that are used simply not to transport the oil, but to store it. Right now in Russia, there's such a surplus, they do not know what to do with the oil. They simply lack a market for it. Nobody wants to buy Russian oil. And that's why today for Russia, it will get more complex and it will not get better. But Vladimir Putin's intransigence to make agreements with the United States or to help end this war is exactly why his regime will fall. If he was smart, if he was a wise man, he would take the steps necessary to preserve his own regime. But fortunately for us, he is not so wise, he is not so intelligent, and that will trigger very dangerous moves within his own country. For Vladimir Putin to go after all these things at once, to go after the oligarchy, to go after people in the FSB, to already be persecuting the military and having arrested at least 17 generals in recent time. These are all signs they're starting to pick too many fights at one time. And that is a key part of any dictatorship. If you want to have allies, that's good. But the only allies you really need, you can't afford to lose, are the intelligence service and the military. But by persecuting both of them, going after both for doing what you told them to do, that's not going to make you more popular, but it will increase the chance that somebody from one of those groups, be it those from the oligarchy or the Silovaki, people like the intelligence service or military, who realize Vladimir Putin is taking a lot of risk with our lives and with our money. Why do we need this? Why do we benefit from this? We could be better without Vladimir Putin. And because of that fear specifically, we know that there will be more problems. So does it surprise you that today Vladimir Putin very rarely goes in public? Vladimir Putin is almost never in Moscow. These are all connected parts of the same story. The Vladimir Putin today has done everything necessary to trigger dramatic and rapid, non-planned democratic change within his country. But if that were to happen, it would happen sometime in the near term. And the reason for that is very simple. Because today in Russia, they're running out of options. But soon, they're going to have even less. And if you think that the military will come save Putin, check out this video, and you'll understand exactly why things are so bad. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.